kind of informal. But anyway, to those folks who are going to tune into this today, I'm talking to Dr. Tom Hochschild. He's an associate professor of sociology at Valdosta State. He got his PhD in sociology from the University of Connecticut, and a master's in Soc and a bachelor's in Soc from Cleveland State University. He's a member of the American Sociological Association, the Georgia Sociological Association, Mid-South Sociological Association too. He specializes in urban sociology, community service, social psychology, deviance, and stratification. In 2018, he was recognized for his teaching ethics award at Valdosta State. In 2016, he won the Presidential Excellence Award for teaching at Valdosta State. I wanted to congratulate him publicly. He recently got married, and he will soon be a dad for the first time in a couple of weeks. Tom's been gracious enough to have a conversation today about what a liberal is. As I told him, we both live in a very conservative place. I tune into conservative radio regularly because a lot of people in my life are conservatives. And I'm disturbed by what's said about a variety of topics. A lot of it's just utterly inaccurate. For the record, I've reached out to conservative talk show hosts about having conversations with them and haven't had any success doing that in order to correct some things. So the idea behind this podcast was to talk with folks who are different political bents than myself and other people that I move around in. And the fact is we don't all agree on everything. I think we're talking about each other more than we're talking with each other. As somebody who's very active in the community here in Georgia, Tom has been on the forefront of a number of kind of activist events and efforts. He's also run for public office, and he's kind enough to be the first person that I get to interview or have a conversation with, really. And please bear with me because I've got a little scratchy throat today. But with that said, Tom, I just wanted to thank you again for being here. I know you've got a busy life, and for being willing to have the conversation. And I hope that you'll bring up anything you want to talk about too.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate you having me on. And like I said, I think I'm excited about this venture, and having these types of conversations with the local community is going to be great, I think. And I think you're a great conversationalist, so I think it's going to go really well.
Yeah, we'll see. I think the other thing is I grew up here, and I wish there would have been some alternative viewpoints on a variety of things, ranging from religion to politics. And that hasn't happened. So I think sometimes we have to kind of create the thing we want. So hopefully this will turn into some of that. Anyway, so as somebody that I think of as a kind of quintessential political liberal, you ran as a Democrat, I believe, when you ran for office. Will you just talk about what a liberal is? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what liberalism is and what a political liberal is.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you invited me to talk about this, it got me thinking about it, trying to sharpen my definition about a little bit more. And there's a couple things that immediately came to mind. First one being compassion. You know, there's the term bleeding heart liberals. It's accurate, I think, in a lot of ways. Most liberal people that I've known in my life tend to be pretty compassionate, pretty empathetic people. You know, whether it's poor people, whether it's racial or ethnic minorities, whether it's members of the LGBT community, we tend to be pretty good at putting ourselves in the shoes of others and empathizing with others. I think that's one major characteristic. In fact, I was laughing a little bit because after President Trump won the election, one of the first things liberals did was ask, well, why did these people vote for Trump? Like, we need to understand the Trump voter. Like, we got to get inside the heads of the Trump voter. I mean, that's a liberal way of doing things. And I think now that Biden has won, I don't think you're going to see the same thing from the right, where they want to understand the mindset of the Biden voter. Yeah. I don't think that's going to happen. So compassion is one. And the other thing I was thinking, Mark, is kind of a certain type of open-mindedness. But I was thinking about it, it's not complete open-mindedness. it's kind of an open-mindedness in terms of culture, I think. So in terms of eating different types of foods or listening to different types of music or being able to appreciate different types of culture, I think liberals tend to be pretty open-minded. But I think liberals are also very closed-minded in some respects when it comes to the mistreatment, or at least the perceived mistreatment of minorities. That's when I think liberals can be very closed-minded, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But when minorities, the downtrodden, are taken advantage of or exploited, liberals tend to tense up a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of this conflict between the right and the left come from.
Can you say more about that? Because I'm not sure I follow.
So in terms of like using correct terminology in terms of racial or ethnic groups or sexual orientation or the way women are talked about, what some people might call political correctness.
Gotcha.
Liberals are more likely to monitor speech in that way. And I think conservatives get really frustrated because there has been inconsistencies in some of the language. Most people are not taught what the correct type of language is and why that is the correct type of language right now. So I think there's some frustration from folks who just don't understand what the rules are and why the rules keep changing. So I can understand some of that frustration.
I got you. And so are you saying that maybe liberals are too critical of conservatives about that when you said liberals can be closed-minded too?
Yeah, I think we need to understand that, education is so important. And when people don't learn why we don't use the N-word anymore, the historical context, the sociological context behind that, rather than just giving them a rule that you can't say this word. I think for a lot of people on the right, that's very stifling and very frustrating. Why are you telling me I can't say this word when we're supposed to be the land of the free?
Wow.
So I think some of this is education, that maybe in elementary, junior high, high school, children aren't learning why certain things are appropriate and certain things are not appropriate. Gotcha. And also the debates behind that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the, when you were talking, and I know you're not saying this, so I want to just play devil's advocate for a second. When you say liberals are open-minded and compassionate, you're not saying conservatives aren't, are you? Do you know what I mean? Because if I was a conservative, there's kind of, I think one of the criticisms of liberals is elitism. Do you know what I mean? Particularly when Hillary Clinton, for example, referred to people as deplorables. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the problems we run into, especially in the United States, is we tend to think in binaries. It's one or the other. It's compassionate or not compassionate. It's socialism or capitalism. It's moral or deviant.
Right.
I think that's one of the problems we have in the United States, is that we need to start thinking about these things on a spectrum. That, of course, there are Republicans who are compassionate. I'm friends and family members with a lot of Republicans who are very compassionate.
There's even that phrase, compassionate conservatism, remember?
Yeah, absolutely. And that phrase, I think, won a lot of Republicans over and some middle of the road folks, because I think unfairly, oftentimes conservatives are labeled as not having any feelings towards others. And I think when we paint each other with these broad strokes, it's harmful to everybody. And I think we're seeing the results of that right now with our current political landscape.
Gotcha. What else would you say about liberalism, or what it is that makes somebody a liberal? So you talk about open-mindedness, compassion.
Yeah. Again, it's I almost wish there was a word for it. It's the open-mindedness I'm talking about is being able to try new things. From my experience in life, the liberals that I have known are more likely to go to different ethnic restaurants and want to try new things, are more willing to travel to other countries and to be humble about it, and to understand that the way we do things in the United States is not necessarily the right way. It's just one way of doing things.
Gotcha. So kind of cultural relativism, or
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of cultural relativism, I think liberals tend to be more culturally relativistic and understand that there are different ways of doing things across cultures. But even within the United States, historically, the way we think about things changes over time, and that our attitudes and our behaviors, they're not static. They're not always going to be the same. And just from my own experience being a conservative when I was younger and being friends and family members with a lot of conservatives, there tends to be more of a tendency to say that the way that we do things is the better way. The American way, the way I was raised, is the right way to do things. And I think liberals are a little bit more accepting of the fact that, it's all contextual, that things change over time, that we're not necessarily right about all these different social issues and political issues.
But because again, I hear the conservatives in my life, chime in, but you're not saying like that there aren't any wrongs or rights out there. For example, that murder is contextual or sexual assault is contextual. You're not saying that, are you?
No, I mean, I think one of the most difficult things in the social sciences and sociology and the anthropology and for some historians is this idea that between the cultural relativist perspective and this kind of absolutism, where this particular behavior is always wrong. So for example, female genital mutilation, which is a practice in some cultures. It's difficult because for a lot of our Western tendencies, a lot of people in the United States would say that's absolutely wrong 100% of the time. This should never take place. And I'm going to do everything in my power to stop this from happening in other cultures. Mm-hmm. Now, the more cultural relativistic side is that, well, maybe this is a cultural practice. It's part of a tradition. And if the girls and women who are participating in this are doing this willingly, then maybe it's okay. And this is, I think, one of the hardest things in college, really, is understanding that in terms of these binaries, instead of just right and wrong, there are these different shades of gray.
Gotcha.
And to be okay with that, it's difficult because most of us are socialized. We're taught to think there's right and there's wrong, there's good and bad. If you're a Christian, there's moral and there's immoral. And I think that's one thing college does, is kind of helps free your mind a little bit in that way and help you understand that our way of thinking is one way of thinking. And that can be really unsettling for people.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think, yeah. Can you talk about like what that means for all of what you've talked about, though, means for policy and law compared to kind of a conservative viewpoint? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a lot of social and economic issues that we're seeing, like Black Lives Matter, for example, you're seeing, of course, a lot of liberals who are waving the banner for Black Lives Matter and supporting it, and white folks being allies, and Hispanic folks and being allies. I think this is a great example of some white folks saying that, I might not be a Black person, but I can put myself in somebody's shoes, or try to at least, and try to understand what it's like to be driving down the road and to be pulled over just because you're Black, or to be thrown against your vehicle, or to be searched unfairly, or to be thrown in jail unfairly. I think liberals are more likely to say, yeah, that is not right. Even though it's not happening to me, it's happening to others, and that's not right. And I'm going to do what I can to stop that. And I don't see as many conservative voices saying that, saying that, this mountain of evidence that we have that Black folks and brown folks are mistreated by the political justice system across the country, that is wrong, and we need to address that right away. I wish there were more conservative voices out there saying that, honestly.
Yeah. Was it fair to say, I mean, I remember teaching social problems, and one of the distinctions, there's kind of this spectrum, and I fall kind of to the left of liberal significantly, but that liberals compared to conservatives are more big government in terms of social programs, in terms of taxation, smaller military, maybe, certain issues, right? Pro-choice versus anti-abortion, Do you think that's a fair analysis, that liberals are more apt to want the state to be involved in regulating corporations, environmental protection, et cetera?
Yeah, I think at this point in time, it's fair to say largely because we've tried free market, we've tried capitalism in regards to healthcare, in regards to trying to keep the environment clean. We've tried to allow the corporations to self-regulate. And unfortunately, we've seen disastrous results. We've seen people who don't get the healthcare that they need, that they're living in pain. They're dying earlier. So I think liberals are more likely to say that, where the free market fails, that government, the people, we need to step in and make sure that, all people have health care, that the air is regulated, that water is regulated, because unfortunately, with corporations, the bottom line is the bottom line, right? It's profits, it's quarterly profits for shareholders. And sometimes that takes precedence over the well-being of the community and the nation.
So are you saying you're a socialist? No, this is a serious accusation, right? Like, I hear it a lot. I've been called it years ago. I worked on a couple of campaigns in Atlanta, Cynthia McKinney for one. And I remember people calling me a communist and a socialist. And I think that word's a weapon, right? That people use, that they often couldn't explain what those two systems are, right? I see it a lot on the threads on conservative talk radio that Biden, I kind of find it funny that people think Joe Biden is a socialist, given, especially after 8 years as VP, with Barack Obama, and then 50 years in the Senate. Like, where's the socialism at? I would say maybe liberal, right? But I mean, what do you say to the whole accusation? And it's kind of red scaring to me. It reminds me of McCarthyism. It's fascinating that this has come up, and the Dems have used it too. I know that Hillary Clinton claimed that certain folks in the Democratic primary were Russian assets. So I always, it troubles me when people say liberals are socialists, because it makes me feel like you don't really know what socialism is, if that makes sense. And I wouldn't consider myself a socialist, but what do you say to all that?
Yeah, I agree completely with what you're saying. I think people use the word socialism as a way to dismiss certain ideas. And I was looking online earlier about surveys about what people think socialism is. And people are all over the place in terms of their understanding of what it is. Some people think that it means the government controls everything and there's no private property.
Right.
Some people think that there is private property, but the government still controls the means of production. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. I mean, I think about it probably the way Bernie Sanders does, that collectively we are taxed, whether you're poor, working class, middle class, rich. We collect that money and we use that money for the common good, whatever that may be. And that could be fire departments, police departments. It could be fixing the roads. So I think, Mark, one problem is that we don't realize that we are all participating in socialism right now in the United States.
You work for a state institution.
What's that? Yeah, I work for a state institution.
School.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a government employee, as is Kemp and Loeffler and Purdue. So we have decided collectively that we need to use taxes for firefighters, for example. Early in this country's history, firefighters were privatized. So you had to buy firefighters insurance. And if your house was on fire and you didn't have firefighters insurance, guess what? Your house would burn down.
Right.
And the problem that middle class and rich people found out is that not only will your house burn down, but it's likely to catch on in the streets, and everybody's house burns down. So it took those mistakes to realize that, no, we need a publicly funded fire department, at least in cities and suburban areas, in order to protect the public good. Same thing with police departments, roads. The military is socialistic because we're all paying taxes to support it. My father was a Vietnam veteran and was 100% disabled, received checks from the Veterans Administration, which came from the taxpayers.
Right.
So these are collective decisions about what we're going to do with the money. The big argument, as you know, Mark, is that we have to decide, do we want to use this for, or we already are using it for healthcare with Medicare and Medicaid,
right,
and veterans healthcare. The question now is, do we want to expand that to make sure that everybody has access to it, including the poor and working class?
yeah. So you're saying, it sounds like, that we already have elements of what would be called socialism in a very
Absolutely.
corporate capitalist nation, right? A lot of people point to the post office as well. And most people would say they wouldn't want to privatize the police department, right? Where you have a Sprint to police department and a Verizon police department. Given our experiences with corporations, I don't know what else to say about the socialism and communism accusations. They just seem to be ways to shut people down and to kind of label people as the language as of late has been really amazing, and the certain words have so much power, right? The word patriot, right, that gets used over and over and over again. But a socialist is one of those words as well. So where are you at with the socialism capitalism divide?
We are in a mixed economy. So are a lot of European nations. It's a mix. It's just a matter, again, instead of thinking in terms of binaries, where on the spectrum do we want to be? A lot of European countries are, a little bit more towards the socialist side. There are the people on the right who are fighting that in the United States now. But for me, I'm a pragmatist. I want to know what works, eventually what is going to work. And we're seeing the results in a lot of European countries and Canada, that people by and large are happy with their healthcare. That students can go to college debt-free, or at least close to debt-free. One of the most frustrating things for me, and I know it is for you, Mark, is having our students going into this massive debt just to get a 4-year degree.
Right.
And sometimes I do question higher education. I don't want our students having this debt for 10 years of their life, 20 years, maybe their whole life, and just paying off the interest while corporations are getting wealthy. I think we can do better than that. And the thing is, we know it's possible. We just have to look at the evidence and, model that type of policy and practice.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you said I want to kind of come back to at some point, but one of the things I sent out and you mentioned on the phone the other day when I called you was, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that 74 million people supported Donald Trump in the last election. I can't remember exactly how you said it, but a lot of folks in my life were really surprised by that. And so I just wanted to kind of see if we could talk about it a while and maybe come back to some other stuff.
Yeah, I was surprised as well. I think we all knew that Trump's core supporters would be there. The people that are showing up to the rallies and the people who have the flags on the back of their trucks. We knew those folks were going to vote for him. I was surprised how many people were going to vote for him. And I think that speaks to a larger divide in the United States than we realized. For liberals, we looked at Trump's past 3.5 years and we said there's a lot of division right now, more division than when he started, racially, socioeconomically. I was kind of thinking that people would be tired of it, honestly. Every day there's some new drama, and most people I thought would just, they want to go to work, they want to travel a little bit, enjoy life, and not be constantly bombarded with all this stuff coming out of the White House every day. So I was actually surprised that many people voted for him. And I think that speaks to the fact that we really need to have these conversations about these social and political issues and try to work these things out between the right and left and try to understand each other a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, why do you think you were I guess the thing is, I'd like to talk about why you were surprised, because it seems like most liberal folks in my life were, and I'm not sure were you surprised because you felt the accumulation of things that he had done and said would sway voters. I talked to, for example, an older person who's a Republican, and I asked him prior to the election. Well, he asked me what I thought was going to happen. I said, I think it's going to be really, really close. and he kind of laughed at me. And this is a Republican, lifelong Republican friend in his 70s. He goes, "There's going to be a blue wave across the country. Joe Biden is going to," I was like, "I don't think so." So he and I talked about why he felt the way he did, but I'm just kind of curious. And I've asked a few liberal friends, like, so what's going on with the surprise?
Yeah, I guess it's because, after 4 years, not only the social divisions, but the handling of COVID or mishandling of COVID, again, compared to other countries that handled it much better. Uh, the constant lies, the falsehoods, the exaggerations. I just thought a lot of people that voted for him that are maybe a little bit more in the middle would say, okay,
Or some that had
made it,
lost family to COVID, right?
yeah, how many people lost family members to COVID? You'd think, and also the Hispanic population, the fact that migrant families are being locked up. I thought the Hispanic vote would go even more so for Biden. So I thought he might get 40 million, maybe 50 million, but I was surprised that it was as close as it is. And it's obviously something we all need to be concerned about.
Yeah.
How are we going to move forward with this, knowing that there's such this vast division in the United States, and it's so polarized right now. You have your Fox News watchers on the right, and your more leftists on the left. How are we going to continue on as a country when there's this much animosity and resentment towards each other?
Yeah. There's a couple of things in there, like working with a bunch of conservative folks. I think one thing, and I don't know if liberals realize it, but in the eyes of a lot of people I talk with, COVID, particularly because of mail-in ballots, right, was a Democratic strategy, right, which leads into that narrative that the election was stolen. So the COVID pandemic didn't seem to kind of get through. And I guess for me, I wasn't too surprised. I had this same issue in 2016 that, and I'm probably not as optimistic as you are about the nation, but it seemed what's pretty clear to me is that Donald Trump in 2016 never said he would concede the election if he won, right? Prior to the primaries being over, he was putting out the narrative that it's rigged, right? Now that narrative went away for a little while after he won, the election in 2016.
Funny how that works, right?
Right. If you win, it's not corrupt, but if you lose, it's corrupt, right? But it's pretty clear, and I don't know if it's deliberate or strategic but it's pretty clear to me that all along he's been kind of laying the ground to sow doubt, not in just the electoral process, right, but almost every other American institution, the intelligence state, journalism, we go down the list, right? I mean, he's so and we get into the runoff up until 2018. One of the things I asked folks about 2016 and before 2016 was over was his base. What if he would have lost? His base is still here, right? And I said in 2016 they'd be radicalized if he lost. Lo and behold, they win. Then they have to try to figure out how to govern. And in the meantime, he's kind of laying the ground for 2020. In case what a lot of people felt was going to happen, he was going to lose, right? You got to have an explanation, when you're kind of sociopathic, for why you lose. So it's the system again. And I've got my own criticisms of the American electoral process. But if you would have, one of the things I said about 2020 was the same thing. Look, we have millions of people that think Donald Trump's a great idea. And what does that mean? If he wins, we have to kind of contend with whatever policies come for another 4 years. If he loses, his base will be radicalized. He will be a martyr, right? So either way, we're going to contend with what's happening and why people thought Donald Trump's kind of a symptom of something larger to me. And this kind of gets into kind of my radical analysis around ideology. in a country founded on kind of white supremacy and male supremacy, I think that's still really alive in us. I think there's ample evidence, empirically verifiable evidence, that Black lives really don't matter. The lives of women really don't matter. So I guess operating from that lens all the time, right, and the fact that we've had no real, just around race, reconciliation, truth telling about that. What we've had is consolation because of social movements. We really haven't come to terms with who we are as a nation, So,
I think
and then you
yeah.
throw capitalism in the midst of that too, and let me just say this one thing and I'll hush. The thing I was surprised about was Southern white Christian evangelical fundamentalists who are not too hip on divorce, gambling, rampant sexual behavior, promiscuity, adultery, and all that, Yankees, right? And people that were born into wealth and who literally say to their base, I'm self-made. My dad gave me a small loan of $100 million, right? My people voted for that dude. Right. Thought he was a good idea. Now, that's one of the reasons I want to talk to conservatives, and I've reached out to a number of folks. Like, I really want to go, like, man, what's going on here? You know what I mean? As a Southerner, as a white Southerner, So anyway, I've said a whole lot. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot packed in there. Again, trying to understand the Trump voter, which is what we do as liberals. We're always looking for that magic bullet. What is that one thing? What's the one reason? And we know as social scientists, these things are complex. There's a lot of reasons. It's economic for some people. It's cultural. It's the social issues, Black Lives Matter, transgender issues. I think media is something we need to talk about a little bit more, the influence of media. I mean, seriously.
Are you talking the major networks? Are you talking major networks or social media or both?
Well, I'd say major networks, and obviously growing is social media, but the fact that, like you said, a Northerner born with a silver spoon in his mouth, daddy helped him all along the way, was supported by so many Southerners.
And working people.
Yeah. I mean, so we have to ask ourselves, is that economic? Do Southerners really think that once Trump is elected president, all of a sudden you're going to have these factories going
to bring the jobs back? Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is it? I mean, being realistic, do you really think that those factories are just going to start popping up in the Deep South? Or is it because the right wingers are fed up with Black Lives Matter and transgender issues, LGBT and women's issues? They're just fed up with it.
And political correctness.
Political correctness, which many people have, like we talked about, have a hard time understanding. But one of my big pet peeves is the influence of big media. I mean, the fact that Trump won speaks to the power, I think, of television. I mean, he had a hit show for 13 years, Celebrity Apprentice. And I've watched a documentary where one of his campaign managers said that was a springboard. They knew that show would be a springboard into political office, because there he is. He's got the tie on and the suit, and he's sitting in the big chair and the long desk, and he's making the big decisions. And when people see that week after week, it becomes ingrained that this guy is a leader. This guy knows how to handle things. And, and I think a lot of people find that insulting. People have been insulted when I've said that before, but I think we are much more influenced by media than we realize or want to admit. I mean, because he really had no experience. He had a lot of racist things in his background. The Central Park Five that he condemned, they were later proven innocent, and all the sexual assaults against women, all these things going against him. But what he had going for him is millions of people tuning in every week, watching his hit show, watching the movies where he makes these celebrity appearances. He was even a professional wrestler, Mark.
Yeah,
I don't know if you remember, he did this stint with wrestling. He knew. I mean, I think Trump is a genius in a lot of ways. I mean, in terms of marketing, he's the modern day P.T. Barnum. He knows how to push those hot button issues. It's pretty amazing what he's been able to do. But I think now is a time where we have to sit back and reflect on why so many people thought a New Yorker who's horrible at business, had a lot of bankruptcies, had this horrible checkered past, was able to convince so many people that he was the right candidate despite his lack of experience. I think political scientists, social scientists in general are going to be talking about this and writing books for many, many years to come.
Do you think they will? I mean, because what I've seen, and I've been critical of my liberal friends about this, and some of the conservative critique I think is really fair. One of the things I saw for 4 years and even leading up to Trump is my liberal friends not being willing to see actually what conservatives were saying, right? Whether it's the Bill O'Reillys, like there's this, conservative GOP propaganda machine, Fox News, Breitbart, we go down the list, right? And they're on a spectrum too. And I think Democrats have theirs as well, MSNBC and so forth, right? So to be fair, but every time I tried to get liberal friends to, and these were colleagues, these were academics, to see what the talking points are. And I also felt like the right, people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, these white men in particular, who are now making millions of dollars as kind of leading this new movement to get back to some fundamental values, which are really kind of the dominant narrative. Every time I tried to get liberal folk to, I'd say, you need to check this out, something important has happened. And what folks would tell me is they couldn't stomach it, that it upset them too much. I think that's where we get the snowflake kind of label. I think conservatives are snowflakes too in their own way. But there's a part of me that's been frustrated because I felt like folks weren't paying attention, right? Because it was too painful. And I don't expect folks of color and groups to expose themselves to individuals who are calling for their annihilation, right? That's a very different thing. But those of us in the majority group, so I think something's happened that folks didn't pay attention to. And you kind of alluded to this earlier. I think you're right. But for me, I was disappointed that no one ever pinpointed Trump or his supporters on when exactly was America great to you. Like, give me a date. Is it the 1950s? Is it the 1940s? Right? What is this mythical time you want to go back to? Because the factual reality of that is, if the 50s, it's not real good for women, right? Not real good for folks who weren't white. If we go down, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Absolutely.
And nobody ever did that, right? So,
but do you think that's true though, Mark? I mean, I saw that question being asked all the time. Reporters going out on the street talking to Trump supporters, asking, "What date are you talking about?" And I saw a lot of Trump supporters really struggling to answer that. Some of them said the mythological 50s, but
yeah, I didn't see them ask him and his administration that question, and so I think there's a couple of things that I've been troubled by, that, and I'm not trying to blame liberals. For me, Donald Trump, again, is a symptom. When he was elected, I joked with a friend and said he's America's id. I think you're right. I think he tapped into what is just below the surface. And in fact, you and I know this personally living here, right? I don't know about you, but I've been nervous all day about having this conversation that's going to be public, right? Because we both know we live somewhere where actually saying what you think, I mean, exercising your rights to free speech, if it goes against the grain of the majority of folks here, there are going to be consequences for that. You've had threats. I've had threats over the years for doing what people say is American, right?
Right.
So I've said a whole lot. I don't know if any of that makes any sense to you or not, but.
Yeah, I think, again, the genius of Trump, even that phrase, "Make America Great Again," it calls back to a nostalgia of an era that really didn't exist, like you said. Maybe for some white men.
Yeah, I think it existed for my dad.
Yeah, and but a lot of people don't realize too, Mark, that era after World War II, the reason there was so much economic prosperity is because so many other countries were in ruin.
Right.
The factories were destroyed. People still needed goods around the world, and we had our factories intact. And so all this wealth accumulation in the United States was a consequence of that, not just American hard work.
Right.
And so now those factories in other countries, they are built and we're competing.
Right.
And so we don't have, you can't, it's hard to get by with just one salary like a lot of at least white families were able to do in the 1950s, where dad goes off to work and mom stays home and
right.
Cooks and cleans, takes care of the kid. Most households today require two incomes.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the nostalgia that a lot of white folks are hearkening back to. But we live in a different time now. And I think a lot of white folks are struggling with that reality.
Yeah.
That it's not, doesn't see any in the foreseeable future that we're going to go back to that.
Yeah. What do you see, or in terms of, in some ways, I think in the past week, what we've witnessed, and again, I'm not a Democrat. I have as many critical issues with the Dems as I do the Republicans. But in some people's eyes, in my world, what we saw in the last week was really a legal attempt at a coup. Now, the other side's saying coup too, right? But the fact that there was over 100 legislators signed on to this Texas suit that the Supreme Court shot down yesterday, and a number of attorney generals. Are you kind of as troubled about that? And it seems to me, both as social scientists, right, one of the things that we learn early on is what holds societies together is social solidarity. There's got to be some kind of glue and collective conscience, and not only that, faith in institutions, right? Those of us on the left haven't had a lot of faith. We've been critical of the intelligence state for years. We've been critical of journalists for years. And it's interesting to see the right now have doubt about these institutions too, not for the same reasons. But with all that said, what are your thoughts now that, Biden will probably be inaugurated in January? But there's I don't know if you saw what happened in Washington over the weekend, right? You and I live in a place where people are pissed off. Mm-hmm. I encounter them every day.
This is a scary time. I mean, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime, where a sitting president is basically saying he doesn't want to leave. Yeah. And the fact that he's got so much support, despite the fact that Biden not only won the popular vote by, I think it's over 7 million now. And, and here in Georgia, I think there's been 3 recounts already.
And not only that, Republicans, secretaries of states and governors have gone along with the certification of these things.
I mean, right? I wonder, how do some of the Republicans get their head around that? These are your people. These are the people that you wanted in positions. And now you're saying that they're actually Republicans in name only, that they're rigging elections to help Democrats win.
I think rhino is the word.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a scary time. I mean, we hope that it's a peaceful transfer of power. That's what's supposed to happen, obviously, that you have an election, and even if your candidate doesn't win, you say, you know what, we're just gonna have to work harder in the next election, and we're gonna get our candidate next time. And a lot of Republicans are saying, no, we don't want to do that. We want to push our candidate now. Yeah. And so what's going to happen if Trump just refuses to leave? Yeah. I'm nervous about it.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things I remind people about our country, some of the things James Madison said were just utterly disturbing about one of the roles of government is to protect the opulent minority against the masses. I think one of the things we don't know our history well enough to really, again, we all have this Disneyland version of how we think the country was created, right? But it's clear to me that, Nixon had a tight race during the Kennedy years and conceded. Gore, we've lived through, right? Mm-hmm. Wasn't happy. A lot of Dems said it was stolen, but in his words, for the good of the country, we're going to let this go and we'll get it next time. I'm not sure that's what's going to happen. These are my people again, in some ways. They would never claim me. but there's, and I think the other thing, sociologically, we don't really have a good grasp on how many of those 74 million folks are really diehard Trump supporters, right? What I do know is you can't buy any ammunition in my town right now, and there's a shortage across the country. I don't know if you know about this.
Right.
The rhetoric, Rush Limbaugh this week was talking about secession. We know that hate group activity since the 2016 election has increased, militia groups, hate crimes, the whole 9 yards. So I don't know what remedies this, if
Well,
there is one,
I'd like to see, I mean, what you think about this. I think the big question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we want to live in a democracy or don't we? I mean, that's really what we're getting at here. Are we okay with living in a society, in a state, living in a city where even if my group doesn't win the election, I'm going to be okay with that, and I'm just going to fight harder in the next election? I honestly think, Mark, that a lot of Republicans don't really want that. I mean, think about it. Most of us, we have a certain way that we think about things, how things should be. We have certain values. We think other people should live in a similar way. That's what we want. And even it doesn't matter, Republicans, Democrats, when the other side wins, we're not happy. We're very frustrated by that. And so there's actually a book out called The Big Sort, where there's a sociologist and journalist talk about how people are sorting themselves into different states across the country based on political ideology. That's why California is so liberal, and New York is so liberal, and New England in general, and other places are more conservative, because people want to live around like-minded people.
Homogenous kind of.
Yeah. So we're in some ways, we're kind of doing it ourselves, but Georgia is a great example of when we're kind of in the middle of that. Biden won by, I think, 12,000 votes here in Georgia. So it's very close, and it's largely an urban versus rural issue.
Yeah. Across the country, I would argue it is.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I think that's across the country it is. It's not just damn Republican, right? It's urban, rural. Which
absolutely.
Something else I want to ask you about too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, take a step back. Even as liberals, should liberals have the right in cities to determine what rural folks do? And should those rural folks, should they have the right to determine what those city folks do? I mean, that's the heart of what we're getting at here. When I drive around here, South Georgia here, I do a lot of traveling. And I'm telling you, I'd say at least 98% of the signs, the yard signs, were Trump signs. Yeah. There's almost no Biden signs that I've seen here in South.
You have to go in communities of color to see Biden Harris signs.
Absolutely. And I'm sure it's different up towards, Atlanta area. So there's a frustration down here in the Deep South. A lot of rural folks saying, why are these folks in Atlanta and Savannah and Albany, why are they determining my future?
But can we get back to the question of whether we want a democracy or not? Because what I hear from the right is the left is what's undemocratic. That the election has been stolen, right? And and they've been fomenting fear. And I think the left, and I don't think liberals are the left, in all honesty, but they get tagged as the left by the right or by conservatives. But I can assure you, all the conservative folks I work with and talk with, think liberals are the ones that are undemocratic, that don't want democracy. That's really kind of what's going on. The other thing I meant to say a minute ago is one of the things I used to talk about in class is that, and Hillary Clinton once said in the 2016 primary that, when she was saying, well, America's always been great. And she also said that we've also always been a democracy. That's not true, right? And I would argue we were never intended to be a democracy, right? So to the point that, we hadn't been a country 100 years before we went to war with ourselves. I mean, literally 600,000 people in the Civil War. And not only that, Southerners there, I mean, when you think about history for a second, not that it's the same thing, but, that war is over the winning, Abraham Lincoln winning the election, and people going, we're not really down with this. So I guess a couple of things. What do you say to the conservative folks who are saying it's really liberals and the left who are un-American, anti-democracy? They're really the ones, that are fascist, because that's another word that gets thrown around a lot.
Well, if you want to talk about frustration, Mark, look at the popular vote for the Gore versus Bush election. Gore wins the popular vote across the United States. Hillary Clinton, I think, is it 3 million votes that she beat Trump by in the election. So here we are, Democrats, liberals are winning the presidency and yet losing the Electoral College, which, as you know, has racist origins and in my mind is a racist entity, because what it essentially does is it gives whites, especially rural whites,
and it was created to do
voting power.
It was created to do that too, right? Back in the day.
Absolutely. So why is a farmer in Iowa, why is this white farmer in Iowa, why is his vote count more than an African-American or Hispanic American in Los Angeles? And how could you possibly justify that?
Yeah, I don't really think people want a democracy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to worry about what we're saying right now. Otherwise, when you and I go to the store on Sunday, we could buy a beer early in the morning. There's no separation of church and state here. People, you're free as long as you go along with folks here. And I say that as someone who's lived here 40 years, right? I think what's fascinating to me as someone kind of left of liberal is watching both sides say the same thing about the other side, and again, I don't think that was kind of the point of the podcast, was I don't think we ever talk to each other. I'm not sure that'll get us anywhere either. But I'm deeply troubled where we're at. And there is this part of me that agrees with a number of scholars that, I contend we're an empire, and you and I both know that civilizations and societies have life cycles. The history is littered with them. And so one of the concerns I have is we've got like the perfect storm, in my opinion, of factors for social unraveling. Whether it's a changing demographic in a society where white people have been accustomed to being in power, growing income and wealth inequality, where white folks who are getting screwed over because of outsourcing of jobs, of NAFTA, need somebody to blame for that. And you can't, maybe we can talk about capitalism a little bit, but I think the national religion really is capitalism, because you can't say it's the system that explains why I don't have health care and why I don't have a living wage, right? You have to blame some group. We've had massive social change in our lifetime, right? I've seen the desegregation of schools. I've seen Bruce Jenner become Caitlyn Jenner. I've seen gay folks have legal and civil rights. And not that we're where I would like us to go, but normal, as you and I know, changes. It changes through struggle and as societies evolve and change. So we've got a variety of factors, and we're not even mentioning things like climate change on top of that, a bloated military budget that Democrats and Republicans consistently support, right? And a culture war that's been brewing, for probably 2 decades, right? And that's not to sound as a pessimist, but like I used to ask students, like, what are the social problems that are most pressing? And they would write a list on the board, and some of those things would come up. And then I asked them, well, who's going to solve these? Who do we think is going to come along and resolve these problems? So anyway, that's another bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, not only the social divisions, but going back to the media thing, I think one difference now from the past is that, the far right media and the far left media they've really increased this political tribalization.
They've capitalized on it.
There's money to be made
Yeah,
by getting people to hate another group. And that's what they've found. I mean, honestly, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I discovered Rush Limbaugh, and I bought his first book, which was called The Way Things Ought to Be. And then I bought his second book, which was called See, I Told You So. And I would read those books over and over. And at that time, I graduated high school, but I hadn't gone to college. I thought Rush Limbaugh was a genius. And in many ways, Rush Limbaugh taught me to hate liberals. And I did. And the irony is I didn't really know any liberals in any meaningful way. I didn't know professors or scientists, but I just knew that there was some group. I was being told there was some group that thought they were better than me, that were trying to tell me how I should live my life. And I resented it. And Rush Limbaugh was very good at pressing those buttons in me. And, I look back at it now and think, how could I have fallen for that? But I see other folks falling for that as well. I don't care if my candidate does X, Y, or Z, but as long as he hates liberals, I'm voting for that candidate.
Yeah.
That's where we are.
Yeah. Well, and he's he and others made an industry out of that, right? A couple of things in terms of major networks. We have to deal with the fact they're owned by corporations that have to generate money. All the research I've seen, and I'm older than you. I was telling a friend who's a plumber yesterday. He's my age. We grew up together, and we were talking about how the news. There were 3 networks. You would get, your local news in the morning, maybe a national thing at lunch, but the local again, 6 o'clock local with the national, 11 o'clock local, right? You had a half-hour national news, right? And you had networks, there were 2 or 3, CBS, NBC, and then later ABC, who had to speak to the political spectrum, right? And long story short, and this is really Matt Taibbi's work. I don't know if you've seen his book, Hate Incorporated, but
no, I haven't read that yet.
He argues that Fox figured out it's just much more profitable to focus on our market and feed them this consistent diet of fear and paranoia of the political other side, right? And he argues MSNBC has figured out the same thing in other networks, right? So we have, and in that, one of the things we have is this default censorship, in my opinion. Corporations are not going to report stories that make their corporations look bad. I've never tuned into a news show like Meet the Press or Face the Nation that have been on for years where anybody's talked about the morality of corporate capitalism, left or right, that there's just some topics that will never make it to the air, right? So if it's going to affect the bottom line of the network, you have this built-in censorship. It's not going to make the story. Movies are the same way. If the movie's not going to turn a profit, it's not going to be made, because that is the standard by which they get made, right? So all that said, CNN in particular just annoys me because they gave Trump millions and millions of dollars of free coverage, right? But then they've made, and their bottom line has gone up since 2015. And so he becomes president, and what do? They're in the business of bashing him. It'll be interesting to see what they do now that Biden's in office, But I think you're right, this polarization, not to mention social media and how that kind of feeds into siloing and how people interact with one another. And I'm not sure there's a way to turn any of that back. I think this might be, not this in particular, this podcast, but the medium of podcasts and so forth. But still, it goes back to what I said about liberals earlier. My experience with folks, and many of which I love dearly, they aren't curious about what the other side is thinking, saying, doing, or feeling. It upsets them too much. And then they're shocked and awed when stuff goes down,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What you were saying before about corporations, I think that's another difference between liberals and conservatives is you'll notice that liberals tend to be more upset with corporations. whereas conservatives tend to be more upset with government. And my point with that is that, well, who's running the politicians?
Yeah.
I mean, politicians don't get elected without money.
That might
in
be
the
a
United
false
States.
dichotomy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these corporations and wealthy people, the Walton family that owns Walmart, when they're donating to political campaigns, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it because they want something from it. And so, like you're saying, the politicians, they're going to pass laws that are favorable to corporate profits, even if it hurts people, regular folks. So I think we need to, in terms of education, explain to people, where a lot of this political corruption comes from with all the lobbyists. I mean, we spend so much money on lobbyists, corporations do.
Right.
How are regular folks like you and me going to get the attention of politicians when we have these major corporations and rich people donating tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars? Yeah. They're not going to listen to the regular people. Yeah. So getting money out of politics, I think, is going to be extremely important moving forward.
Yeah. Well, there's a great book called Democracy Incorporated by Sheldon Woolen that talks about what he calls it a corporate coup d'etat, that the state and the corporate structure are one and the same, right? And Eisenhower talked about the military industrial complex. So it's not a new idea, right? And that war is really big business. But well, I think that kind of leads me to ask you something about capitalism. One of the things I've asked students over the years about ideological systems like white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, it seems to me, and I see it in myself, even this week I've seen it, that when you're steeped in a corporate capitalist society, because I'm not an anti-capitalist, I think I used to grow plants and I put my labor and I bought resources and I have to make a profit to do that. I don't think I should swindle people, but bottom line is you need to make a profit, right? But when we talk about corporations and stockholders, and the bottom line is you're either profitable or you go away no matter what you do, and its impact on people in the world, that's another conversation, right? But as somebody that was socialized in this society, bombarded by millions of advertisements about who I should be, what I should look like, what I should buy, what I should wear, where I should live, what I should drive, right, to be a success. And I guess what I'm asking is that there's a part of me that feels like those of us, we almost need a rehabilitation or detox from consumer capitalism. Because we're a society, and Dr. King talked about this, Marx talked about how capitalism commodifies everything into a resource to be exploited, right? So when I was a kid, if you wanted a job, you'd go to a personnel department. Now it's a human resource department. We got turned literally into resources. The natural world is a resource, right, to be exploited. So it seems to me that we've all been, there's some kind of psychic damage almost, to the point that, do we really see other people, not to mention the kind of racial and gender differences and so forth, as people? Are we capable of doing that in a capitalist society, unless there's some process to be critical of how that system has impacted me, and I operate from a logic of it? And let me say two more things and I'll shut up. This week I was sick and I needed to go to work, but I felt guilty about calling in sick. And I'm thinking, that's the silliest thing. Why in the world would I value why am I afraid to call in sick and risking my health? Like, I'm literally prioritizing, right? Like, that's kind of sick, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. I was doing that. I made some cookies one time and they're really good. I make the best chocolate chip cookies. And I handed them to a friend. These are all just examples of how the logic of capitalism is embedded in us, I think. And the first thing she said was not how good they were, thank you. She goes, "You could make money off of these." Like, if it doesn't have a dollar sign attached to it, it has no value, right? So, having said that, it seems to me that we have been socialized into multiple ideological systems, corporate capitalism being one, but patriarchy being another, white supremacy, militarism as another, that drive a lot of our behavior and perception of reality. And there's not really a mechanism. Now, I think one of the things we would disagree on is that I don't think education is enough, because sociologists have been teaching about capitalism for decades now. We've been, how many more times we got to study the relationship between poverty and crime, right? But the truth of the matter is, in the hundreds and hundreds of students I've had, I can't name 5 that are out actively trying to change the world. I mean, because the reality is they have to go make money. They have to pay bills. They start families. They need medical care, right? So, well, I mean, what do you think about that in terms of the idea that we all are the carriers of an ideology that shapes how we feel, what we think, what we can imagine, and what do we do about that if there's any validity to it?
Yeah, I know I'm a broken record, but I mean, let's go back to media. The last statistic I heard was that the average American sees 3,000 advertisements every day. We consume more media than any human beings ever in history. So there's no surprise then that there's a correlation between all these commercials telling us that we're not good enough, that if you buy product X, people will like you more, and us using leisure time to go shopping. We spend more of our leisure time shopping than anybody around the world. And I think it's really sad. It's this internalized capitalism that you're talking about, that we feel like we constantly need to contribute to this capitalistic cycle. We're either producing goods or providing services, or we're consuming.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to contribute in some way. And that is unfortunate. I think what's going to happen, Mark, is we're going to run into, and we are running into a point where we're going to run out of resources. Not everybody can live the way that we live in the United States right now. I heard someone say that we would need 3 to 5 planet Earths in order to sustain the American lifestyle, if everybody around the world lived the American lifestyle. So it's just a matter of time that we're going to have to change, whether we like it or not. I would rather be proactive and start talking about environmentalism and sustainability now, rather than throwing it on my kids or grandkids down the road.
But how do we, I mean, the big question though is how, if that is when I think of ideology, I think of an operating system and a computer, right? So we're the hardware, these ideologies are our operating systems. If I've been taught to value that I'm only worthwhile if I have money, you know, and if I have these things, and if I had status that comes with those things, and that's how I existentially move through the world. And if you threaten my income, and you're threatening my identity, right? And then that's tied to gender, right? Because if I'm a real man, I'm bringing home money, and you know, real men make a lot of money. It seems to me there's this internalized value system, like they can't fathom a different value system that actually might liberate them from this cage that we're in. I mean, this is a tough one, because when people love me, people of color love me when I will talk about race, but if I talk about capitalism or patriarchy, the conversation gets really quiet pretty quickly most of the time. So if you have this group of people whose whole identity and sense of reality is based on stuff, and not only that, I see it in myself. I would argue we feel most alive when we're spending money, when we're shopping. Like, you know, people would say hiking, but we've commodified that. Like I used to joke in Portland, you have to have a Subaru Outback, you have titanium walking poles, you got to have Italian leather boots, you got to have Gore-Tex pants on to go for a walk in the woods. Like there's a way capitalism and consumption and consumerism, right? It permeates everything, right?
And yet at the same time, we all like to think that I'm not influenced by the media. I'm my own person.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things, again, going back to sociology, anthropology, and just college in general. it teaches you that we are social beings, that we are influenced by others in ways that we don't even realize. I mean, even you and I study this stuff, and there's ways that you and I think and behave. We're not even realizing how that's tied into larger power structures.
Yeah.
Until sometimes you reflect and catch yourself once in a while.
Well, it seems to me, and you kind of alluded to this, I've often thought that if we were really, and I think there's variations in our society, but the whole group of us, like if we really loved ourselves, capitalism wouldn't work. I mean, because we couldn't be sold products we don't need, to solve problems we don't necessarily have. So I think we're grappling with that in a place where, and I struggle with liberals around this too, because when we measure social progress, what I hear two things, and I have big problems with neo-liberalism, but the measure for social progress is usually social mobility. And I'm kind of a Kingian, like I'm an idealist. I'm still interested in what King was talking about, a beloved community where people are valued more than things and stuff. And Jimmy Carter said the same kind of stuff, probably stole it from King. But when I see measures of social progress, generally what I see is some measure of capitalist gain.
Yeah, I was thinking Dow Jones, right? That's media is constantly reporting. Look at the economy is great. Dow Jones, despite the fact that right now we've got lines miles long of people who just don't have food.
Yeah,
there's this disconnect between the media and the capitalists versus how regular folks are trying to survive every day, I think.
Well, that's one of my struggles, though, and don't know if I'm being clear. I have two good friends that work for a major corporation. They identify as lesbian and queer. They're married. And that corporation does some pretty bad things. And at the same time, I think they're living the American dream. And the social change I've been interested in and thought I was a part of for years, specifically as a liberal, was something different. The point wasn't for people to assimilate and get jobs in an oppressive corporate structure, a militaristic country, you know what I mean? It's like James Baldwin said, he wasn't interested in integrating into a burning house, so the struggle wasn't so marginalized folks, people of color, folks of different sexualities, whatever, now get to work in corporate America, now get a position in a cabinet, and keep in mind, we're in the longest wars of our history, and there's no anti-war movement. There's not a whimper of one, which I find troubling and kind of endemic of an empire, So I don't know if I'm being clear, but I think when a lot of liberal folks I've talked to measure progress, they're still doing it by dominant standards. When we measure gender progress, it's all what women get to do that men once only got to do. It's not, have men really changed? Are men better fathers? Are men more peaceful? Are men healthier? Right. It's what women can do. So they fight in the MMA, they get to fight in combat, they get to be a CEO and be oppressive, and I'm not interested in that, because I think none of that, given what you just said, is sustainable. I think our lifestyle as Americans is just not sustainable. So the point's not to get people into a problematic social structure.
So from what I'm gathering from what you're saying, is not so much assimilation into this these patriarchal social structures, military or like MMA or whatever it is. It's more about a kind of holistic growth where men, for example, can be more show emotion and be emotional and be good fathers.
Yeah. We don't need to
rather than measuring women.
You know what I mean? Like we don't. Somebody asked me, and it's one of the things I want to talk to conservatives about. you and I have read all the stuff you're not supposed to read as it relates to, critical thinkers, right? Whether it's Marxism or whether it's Black feminist thought or queer theory or a lot of stuff that would scare a lot of folks. But again, in a free society, I thought we weren't supposed to be banning books. And, I want to form my own opinion. So I read that stuff. But the irony to me being back in Georgia is the most radical book I would say I've ever read was the Gospel in the New Testament. I mean, it's not a book, but the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and John. And that's still where my politics come from. This dude, Jesus, in a way, not in the evangelical sense, but, being exposed to that as a kid in Sparks, Georgia, there was something that seemed really right about how we're supposed to treat one another and that we're all family, and with that said, what I wanted to ask you was, because I was never really a conservative. I certainly grew up in a racist family and racist community, very sexist, and I participated in some of that. But how does somebody become a liberal like that, starts off a conservative, trying to figure things out as you're growing up, listening to Rush Limbaugh, reading his books,
Yeah, I mean, part of it, one of the major things that happened to me is, I went from living a middle class lifestyle to living in poverty. My father is a disabled vet, and so I had to go out and work this shitty $5.25 an hour minimum wage job, and working with all Black men on the shop floor and being approached to be a manager, despite the fact that I wasn't good at the job. That opened my eyes more than anything. I mean, we all know that life's not fair. Everybody knows that. But until that point, I didn't realize how unfair. And I've had a lot of different jobs like that where I'm automatically assumed to be better at the job just because of my whiteness and maleness. And that actually sent me on the trajectory of taking college courses, and especially my sociology courses.
Yeah, but why do you think like so many people would have just run with that and never noticed that you were getting preferential treatment? Do you have any ideas about why? You know what I'm saying? Because that happens all the time to all kinds of folks, and people think, well, that's just how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. So some folks, that's a good point. Some folks might have thought in terms of meritocracy. I must somehow deserve to be a manager, because otherwise it creates this cognitive dissonance. I mean, if I feel like I'm getting promoted just on my whiteness, it creates this dissonance in my head that I'm not worthy, and that racism really does exist and is a problem. And a lot of people, because of their education or lack thereof, have a hard time dealing with that. Where I think my father was a very compassionate person. He's Republican, but cared a lot about helping African Americans, Hispanics. He hired women in his window cleaning business. So that was really profound for me to see my father with a small business being very proud of the fact that he was hiring racial and ethnic minorities. He had a lesbian window cleaner working, and so
he was a fair conservative in a way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's caused me to think a lot about Republican and Democrat and how it isn't just binary, that there are a lot of shades in the middle. And I think that's really where most people are, is somewhere in the middle.
I still find it fascinating.
Polarized.
Yeah, I still find it fascinating that you went in that direction, though, because I encounter people all the time. And again, if our programming is only to see the things that validate our programming, I'll use an example. My dad, remember being in a car with him one time, and a woman passed us and she cut him off, and he goes, "Damn woman driver." And I just said to him, I was like, "Pop, like, how many men have cut you off?" And he doesn't notice. He only notices it, or did notice it, when it was women, because it met his kind of the trope of women can't drive, right? And so with this thing with inequality, I'm fascinated constantly when I have conversations with folks that people will literally admit to me that they know that other people in their business, in their world are being treated unfairly and they're being treated better, but it doesn't register as wrong.
Well, that's right. Doesn't that go back to that? That goes right back to what you were saying, this internalization of the capitalist ideology, where we're not community members. I'm competing with you. I can't have that much empathy for you because you're my competition.
Yeah.
Doesn't that?
Well, no, these are people typically under them. They're not. They're doing the work.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, and I don't think there's an answer to, necessarily, because I've been asked a similar question throughout my life about, like, why this trajectory, and my parents just told me I just like trouble, and I don't think that's true. But for me, it's, growing up in a violent home, and experiencing dehumanization firsthand, and not having safety. Not, when you're 8 years old and that's going on, where do you turn? Who do you tell? And not only that, you don't even have the tools to discern that it's not your fault. I think that's one of the tricky things about ideology and abuse. And, this, like, the first battle is figuring out that you're not causing these other people's behavior. Right. And if you can do that, so all that's to say, I think, that's not the world I want to live in. And so I went down that road because I had a little taste for years and years and years of what it meant to feel powerless, to feel invisible, silent, and also that I wouldn't make it out of it.
Do you ever wonder how your life or how your thinking might be different had you not had those experiences? Would you maybe be a little bit more conservative?
Yeah, I think, I think I mentioned this to you on the phone. We're people who think that people's behavior is explained by life experiences, epigenetics maybe too, but a lot of why people do what they do have reasons, so it probably would be real different. And I say that because one of the frustrating things I see among liberal folk is, I see it even with the comedians, Colbert and the rest of them. They're making jokes at a time where I feel like the country's unraveling, and they don't recognize it, and they're fueling that process because they're laughing at people that are once again doing things and thinking things and believing things for reasons. I'm not saying the reasons are good ones that that we should, necessarily believe ourselves, but social behavior has causes, instead of getting interested in why that's going on in order to kind of engage it. I think the liberal folks, just like conservative folks, are real quick to other people different from them at times.
I mean, you make me think of the slur white trash.
Yeah.
That has unfortunately become normalized in our society, and to the point that some poor white folks have internalized it and use it to talk about themselves. I mean, I think that's really unfortunate. And I agree that
or deplorable.
Some of the elites, professors, don't talk enough about that issue. Why is it in our society that we can talk about poor white people in such derogatory terms?
Yeah.
And so I can understand some of that resentment.
Yeah. So I don't know what can be done about that, but I think it's a real issue, and yeah. It's a whole.
Yeah, I mean, but if you and I are both saying that we had these life experiences that changed the trajectory of our life, which I think for the better for most of us, what does that mean for other folks who don't have these experiences or might not ever have these experiences in their lives? How do we give folks the opportunity to have these experiences? Not to say that they will automatically become liberal, but put people in situations where they will understand these things on a deeper level, not just reading a textbook
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think the other reality, I said this to a person recently, PhD, um, I think liberals need conservatives a whole lot more than conservatives need liberals.
In what way?
I think conservatives make the country work. I think they fix the cars, they make the water come out of the pipes, they grow the food, they make the electricity work. Um, and I think liberal folks forget that. You know, I think urban folks forget where all the fucking food comes from, you know, where the stuff comes from, who makes it, um, who grows that food we need.
It's
Uh,
interesting. The loss of status in these
well,
blue
we're
collar
utterly
jobs.
interconnected, right? But I don't know how many conservatives need PhDs. um, uh,
So what do we do that? I mean, what do we do? I agree that people who work in factories, people who are working the land, the status isn't what it should be. And then that is important. I mean, people want to take pride in the work that they do, and they want others to feel, to appreciate that the work that they're doing. And we have in the past, whatever, 50, 60, 70 years devalued some of these jobs. What do we do to reverse that, to show people that these are our important jobs and you are valued members of society?
well, I don't know if there's one solution. I think one of the things I've witnessed and been guilty of it at times is political segregation. You know, I think the podcast, one of the things this is about is like, I've left this place and come back because there's not a space for any viewpoint other than the dominant one here. And that's why people leave rural places and small towns and go to cities, right? Looking for a community, looking for their people, looking for safety sometimes, right? Um, and at the same time, so there's been this geographical segregation. And most liberal folks I know don't ever engage conservative folks unless a service is needed. We hang out with people just like us. Um, and I think it seems to me that conservatives in my life, at least, because I live in a working class place, all my neighbors are Trump supporters. We talk politics occasionally, but we help each other out incredibly. And I would argue the behavior does more to undermine the stereotypes about who I am than anything I'll ever say. You know, when I show up when it's not my issue, but something needs to be done and it's conservative folks, I want to help them as much as I want to in justice, you know, because conservative folks are getting played too economically and otherwise. I mean, the opioid epidemic, police harassment, housing, right? Uh, it's all the intersectional thing, right? But I don't think we get close to that world enough. And that's one of the reasons I left academia among many. I don't know about you, having come from working class people. My dad had a GED, picked cotton. I had never felt comfortable in the middle class world. And I've been invited into it a number of times. I married into it. Um, it's not my world. I find it very foreign, and not to be too crude, but inauthentic a lot, repressed a lot. And I think there's something you have to give up in our society to move in that world. And that's not to romanticize working people and folks struggling to get by. Um, but it's not my world. And at the same time, my world is not this other one either anymore, right? Because I use words that just totally out me as like, you know, are you sure you're one of us? And if you have a political disagreement or if you wear a mask, you're outing yourself. Um, but one of the reasons I came back to Georgia from Portland was I would rather be in Georgia than Portland, and people in Portland could not fathom that. Um, and that's kind of a whole nother conversation about kind of progressive racism and elitism. And I'm not convinced, and not you, because I know you try to live your values, but I would argue a lot of liberal and quote unquote progressive folks who claim to want social change really don't want it. It's about their identity, and they're actually actively working to maintain the status quo all the time, because they wouldn't know who they were if they give up their lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, as we both know, if you're not actively working against the system, you're complicit in the system. So
we're
you might vote, might vote Democrat every election, but if you're not standing for Black Lives Matter and, you know, protesting and writing letters and doing all those things, you can say you're liberal all day and vote liberal, but it's not meaningful.
Yeah.
To me anyway.
But we're all kind of complicit. I think that's the other thing, because you mentioned binaries early on. Where our food comes from, where our clothes come from, where the gas comes from, this lifestyle that we all enjoy has political implications, right, that are literally reverberating out globally. You know, so this idea, I went to a protest in Portland one time where people were dangling off a bridge. It was Greenpeace. And they were trying to stop an icebreaker that was headed to the Arctic to, you know, they were opening up Anwar to drill for oil. And there were hundreds of people there chanting, you know, something about no oil. And I looked around and everybody had driven there. And I was like, you know, we're kind of hypocritical here, folks, you know, like, so we're all implicated. You know, I think that's the other thing. I'm a product of this, and I still struggle with all these things internally. You know, I'm not pure. I'm not woke. You know, I think that's another real fascinating area to get into. But to get back to your question, I think when we really do start being human, you know, and when we surprise people, that when we help out and pitch in to things they wouldn't expect us to do, you're talking about create some cognitive dissonance. I think that humanizes us, and it kind of starts creating cracks in the term socialist or all the other ways we've been dismissed. You know,
I think those everyday acts of kindness you're talking about are really important and can affect a lot of change. It can have ripple effects beyond what we see. But I honestly, Mark, one of the more frustrating things about being a liberal for me is that the way I perceive it is I'm doing everything I can to help everybody have healthcare. Republican, Democrat, I hope you have healthcare. I hope you have great healthcare. That's great. But as we've seen with COVID, things can change very rapidly.
Yeah.
You can lose your job. You can lose your health insurance. So that's one thing I really struggle with, is wanting to make sure that everybody's taken care of, no matter what situation, that nobody's mistreated by the police, no matter what your race or ethnicity. And the people that I feel like a lot of liberals are fighting for are the ones who hate us, despise us.
I don't know if they know I'll ask folks. I don't think they conceptualize liberals as being in their camp.
And being in their camp?
Yeah, like having their interest at heart too. Not to put the responsibility back on liberals, but I don't think the messaging, right, has been too great about that. And some of it I don't think you can get around because of ideology, right? But
if you take something like healthcare, that's pretty straightforward.
Liberals
have always been for universal healthcare.
You would think.
I mean, if you remember, Hillary Clinton had that card that she held up. Universal healthcare, doesn't matter if you're poor or rich, everybody's going to get a basic minimum amount of healthcare. Even if you're conservative, if you're Republican, that one is not very complicated.
Yeah.
If I don't have healthcare and I'm suffering, if I'm in pain, and those folks say that I'm going to get the pills that I need or the surgery that I need, that's pretty straightforward.
I don't think it is in the context of capitalism in this society, right? Because the powers, the people who have an interest in maintaining the system label it socialist. Talking about socialist medicine, You're going to lose your doctors. I think that is, well, I know that's the perception because I just helped a couple of people enroll in Obamacare who haven't ever had insurance. And they were utterly convinced that they wouldn't be eligible, that they, they don't have a doctor now to lose. Right. But I think the perception of what, and also there is this paranoia that we're going to become a socialist nation. Right. And again, you can't talk about, well, we can find some of that money if we trim the military budget a little bit. We can still have a military and so forth. But I don't think people identify with it. And it may be just because the political divide is so deep and people have, totally written one another off and gotten very binary. But most people, well, the other thing is you shouldn't go bankrupt if you go to the doctor, even if you have insurance, right? So you would think it would be in folks' interest. I don't know if people know that. And then there is, I think, also the legacy of it being tied to Barack Obama, the first biracial president of the, you know what I mean, who was supposedly a Muslim and all this other garbage, right?
Yeah, I think with Obamacare, I mean, one thing I think we all kind of know, but one thing I've become even more and more aware of is that we are creatures of habit, human beings, generally speaking, and that, women's right to vote, for example, is not a controversial issue right now. We're so used to it. The United States has had it for a long time. If you were to talk about getting rid of women's right to vote, there would be massive protests in the street. I think at some point we will have universal health care. I think Obamacare is a step in that direction. It gets, at the very least, it gets people used to having health care who maybe never had it before. And then once you try to take it away, then people are more likely to get upset. They're used to having
it. Kind of happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was part of the plan. If you can't have universal health care, you can have Obamacare, which is really compulsory capitalism.
Well, it's not really health care, it's insurance. And healthcare and insurance, I don't think people make that distinction either. Having access to healthcare is not the same thing as having insurance that pays for access to healthcare. Because you're right, the state just pays Blue Cross, right? So the corporations, we'll go along with it as long as it's offset through the through the feds. I mean, don't you find it fascinating that even that kind of what you would think would create a lot of common ground, we can't seem to come together on? Because I want conservatives to go to the doctor just like I want liberals to.
Yeah, that's the one that surprises me the most. I mean, here in South Georgia, if there's one issue I think Republicans and Democrats get along most on is probably the environment. You have a lot of hunters here and people who like to go fishing, who want clean waterways. This is something liberals have been championing for a long time, cleaning up the air, cleaning up the water.
Yeah, I would say conservatives have too. I mean, I don't think they get credit in the ways, like I grew up with Ducks Unlimited, then there was Quail Unlimited. There was really a concerted effort among conservative folks who wanted to pass down certain traditions. So it was about maintaining habitat. It was about keeping it unpolluted. It was about, not overshooting game. So I got to give them some credit for that too. I don't think it falls under the guise of traditional environmentalism, but certainly have played a part in it.
Yeah, but going back to those corporations that we were talking about, who are large producers of carbon dioxide emissions and whatnot, and liberals are the ones I think who are voting for more miles per gallon in terms of gasoline. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and as you probably know, we had some serious problems. Our lake caught on fire.
That's never good
because of the pollution.
How do you put
Los
out
Angeles, if you see old pictures of Los Angeles,
wait. When the lake catches on fire, do you call the fire department? What do you do, man?
Maybe we need a new agency for something like that. I don't know.
The lake is on fire. Who do we call? Wow.
But
you can laugh, but you kind of got to.
Yeah, you have to. Los Angeles, New York, we've seen all those pictures in the 60s and 70s of smog and how horrible it was, and now we've got stricter regulations, and the air is definitely not perfect, but it's much better than it used to be. So I think that's one area where maybe we can come together on a little bit more.
Yeah. All right, we're almost at 2 hours, so maybe we should wrap it up. But like looking towards the future, this might be a good place to kind of end it. How are you feeling? Like, what do you have any predictions? And it's not for two white guys to figure this all out, so that's not the point of the conversation. But what are you thinking and feeling, especially as a new dad here pretty soon?
Yeah, sometimes you feel hopeless, but you just got to keep chipping away every day. And I have had a lot of talks about this. I try to be optimistic, even though it's difficult sometimes. And, I am in the privileged position of being able to affect social change, to teach hundreds of students every semester. And so that keeps me optimistic. And I see in the younger folks more open-mindedness in terms of racial and ethnic relations, in terms of LGBT issues. When I first moved down here 10 years ago in South Georgia, I didn't think students were going to be as open-minded as they are. And so that gives me hope in a lot of respects. And, in terms of the social media and the fake news, a lot of my family members, they're really good at pointing out the BS. They know when somebody's trying to manipulate them. So I think media literacy has become a topic that more people are talking about in schools. So I try to remain hopeful for the future generations, but it is a challenge, as you know, and you try not to let it get you down. I know it's got to be tough being a Republican in a place like Portland. Just as it's tough being a Democrat in a place like South Georgia.
Yeah. Cool. Anything you want to ask me before we wrap it up?
So what future plans do you have for the podcast? And
I don't know. I don't know if it'll work or not. I've got calls out to a number of people. I'm having a hard time finding conservatives that'll talk to me. So I'm reaching out to 2 more people next week. But the idea is to have people from different kind of walks of life on and to have a conversation. We'll have some BLM folks, hopefully, maybe some Antifa people, a socialist, conservatives. I want to talk to some local pastors. So it's just a way to carve out a little space, and it's a feeble and futile attempt to dispel some of the misinformation about what's being said on both sides, I think. Not that there's not more than 2. So
hopefully what will happen though, Mark, is if Republicans see your podcast and see that, you're a fair guy and it's not a gotcha kind of show, that they'll get a fair shake. I think there'll be more Republicans, conservatives who are likely to come on.
Yeah, I'm not interested in getting anybody or embarrassing anybody. I want to be able to disagree, and that's a tough one. Like I'm fascinated by our inability to disagree with one another and not dehumanize one another. And so we'll see what happens.
Yep, I'm excited for you.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for doing this today, and congratulations on all the recent changes and then coming new arrival, and keep me posted. Let's go get a beer. At some point, even if we have to sit outside, keep a little distance, we can do it, man.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that.
Okay.